If you are two people going into a studio together, do you have a partnership agreement? Do you have a shareholders agreement? What is your structure? These are the things that actually stop arguments later. Because what the nightmare scenario is that you've gone in with a two-person studio, or we've made this game, it's gone off.
Yeah.
There's suddenly a lot of money, or there's suddenly, a lot of money, whatever that looks like to you, in this equation. And suddenly that's what the argument becomes about, because you've got no way of distributing that money back to yourselves.
Welcome everyone to a new episode of the Zero to Play podcast. I'm your host, Carla Duke, and today I'm joined by Vee Pendergrast. Vee is the operations manager at Code, the New Zealand Centre of Digital Excellence, and has worked as a video game consultant for different studios and government bodies over the years in areas of grants, stimulus packages, and more. Today, we'll be talking about Vee's advice for those interested in pursuing games as a career, the ins and outs of funding grants, and how to best position yourself to be a successful applicant and make it in this industry. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of the Zero to Play podcast. All right, welcome Vee to the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Carl.
Okay, so we've spoken over the past year on and off, and you've been a great resource for me just at a government level to understand some of the things that are happening, because it can get very complicated, and I'm going to try my best to keep the conversation of this podcast to be understood in layman's terms. Just because government issues and policies can get complex and long, but I appreciate having you on the podcast, and I hope to I hope that the game developers listening can learn a thing or two that can help them navigate in this complicated world that is hopefully going to become more welcoming and encouraging for game developers wanting to make it. So the first question that I want to ask, and we'll be dipping around different conversations from government bodies to what you're doing at Code to advice for game developers and things like that. But starting off with Code, I'd love to know just what your day-to-day looks like as an operations manager and the kind of value that you're bringing there at Code.
So my primary duty with Code is around the grant stimulus side of our business. So I've now taken over, I basically run all the executive function on that. So what does that mean? That means that I'm constantly talking to developers and explaining how, why you're applying for a grant, what the instance and what code is, what our specific aims are. And so I'm used to having that pub discussion with developers. When I finish work, I go to see friends and they're developers too. I mean, we're not talking about tax policy, put it that way. But my day-to-day is I run 2 funding programs per year, and that's our Kickstart and Startup levels of Code, the 0 to 40K prototyping fund, and a 50 to 150K startup fund for when we actually got a business now, and we're putting people on and working out what the next steps are and aiming for sustainability. I also look after on-demand programs like Scale Up, which is a 250K match fund for mid-level companies to grow ambition, put more staff on, and the aims and become around that. And I also run the Service Start program, which is probably the least exciting program we've got, but it's for service businesses in the game sector, because Tim Ponting, our establishment director, and myself had that conversation around, hang on, how come we're not supporting these kinds of businesses as well? Yeah. So for the first time ever, I was able to design a grant around that. I also book all the workshops, and I do a lot of the social media and the general, and also I'm always talking with developers I'm remote, so I'm always via Discord, via phone, via Zoom. All that sort of thing, and then approving milestones and managing payment cycles and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. I work remote. I'm currently still not in New Zealand because of this wonderful pandemic and the associated border controls, but hopefully this year I'll be and I start really early in the goddamn morning because of that. I'm usually online from 5 a.m. my time every day.
Yeah.
So if occasionally I yawn on something, don't kill me.
No worries. Oh, that's amazing to hear that you're so hands-on, and I think all of the amazing news that I interviewed Ericos Watson on the podcast at the end of last year, and just hearing his story was amazing. And it's amazing just how every a successful grant applicant that goes through code, just how much of a life-changing moment that is for them and their journey, and just the wider New Zealand games industry as a whole as well. And what I love is that we're still so early in the journey of these developers and code's journey, that the benefits we're only going to see in, you know, a couple years time. I guess a follow-up question from that is, like, what do you, like, what would you hope code looks like in 3 to 5 years time? Is it more of the same, or is there bigger ambitions once you kind of get the ball rolling?
Oh, I've got to be careful what I say here. All right, no. So, I mean, my ambition is really rooted around. So, we've got the Dunedin factor, right? So, right now, Code is a regional development program focused on the city of Dunedin, Otepote, Dunedin, in the South Island of New Zealand. I had to learn where that was. Now, my ambition is more about the industry than actually code itself. Because what I would like to see for Dunedin is 5 medium-sized companies, maybe even a bigger one, you know, with 30 to 50 employees and a bunch of indie studios frothing around all that. I want to see a vibrant ecosystem where it's actually putting a lot back into the community as well, because that's the why, you know, it's why we do this. Is not, this doesn't happen in isolation, right? And I want to see that contributing back to the industry in New Zealand as a more of a macro thing. And then I would want to see code. I mean, I want to see Code's brand name. I mean, I love expos. I love video game conventions. Of course, for the past 2 years, I've been jonesing for them, you know. And an online expo or event just does not give the same vibe. It just really doesn't. It's the carnival atmosphere that I kind of miss. But I want Code to go to GDC in San Francisco or Gamescom in Cologne. I love Cologne. I really like that show. But having, you know, opportunities rolling in, people see the name Code New Zealand, and they are so, and like a publisher knocks in because I've seen your games, your quality is exceptional coming through, and you've gone through a due diligence process, and then it helps people along in that journey. Code's a lot different in the way, the philosophy that we run the organization than other screen agencies where I worked before. I mean, I'm not dissing them or anything, but we are really super hands-on every day with our developers. You know, I have developers constantly messaging me on Discord, and or the cycle never ends. And we've got 14, 15 teams now sitting that we've got currently in the program. You know, we've got some that have gone through and exited that outside because we're a year and a half in now. But just that constant dialogue with developers is where it's at, and that's how we're getting the results that we are. I don't want this to be Code's party political broadcast.
Yeah.
But you know, the results are speaking for themselves now. And it's exciting to watch, and it's exciting to watch that maturity. I guess so that answers the 3 to 5 question. Is like studios that have been through the program and now standing by themselves.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
The other thing I really want to touch on that point is in terms of culture. I learned the hard way through making some terrible mistakes that culture begins on day one, which is something that Liam Esler, who's a very prominent personality in the Australian video games, mentions every like all the time. I got the studio culture for our business completely wrong. And so I'm really mindful about encouraging that healthy studio culture. And of course, with Tim getting and the rest of the Code team support and making sure that the developers that come through our program, we're instilling those values in them, because those values will take them through in the long term. Whereas we just did, like in my own studio, we just didn't get that right. Freely admit that. Life's hard lessons, right? That's part of the reason why I do what I do now, is those hard lessons. But instilling that, so getting that culture, that vibe, so the scene in Dunedin is really positive, it's really constructive, and it's got an optimism in it. Now the bigger question is, what does that look like if there's ever that situation where we go nationally? Because that's always the question, right? The first thing is this is a regional program, and of course, then, well, when's my turn? When can I have it? And I would say that I would want to see that all reflected nationally as well.
Yeah.
and I'm about personally about always being, I mean, I'm always the little guy first, helping them out, getting the start, getting that really positive start.
Mm-hmm. So I have an interesting question with a lot of the indie devs that I've spoken to, and I see this common thread of changing your mindset from developing a game to developing a studio. And I guess my question, whether it's from Code's perspective, from assigning a grant, or just from your overall perspective of the games industry, do you think it's possible for indie devs to think about their game, or do you think it's crucial that they think about themselves as a studio from the very beginning?
Well, I mean, the answer is like with most indie devs that come in the door with their Kickstart grant, which is a 0 to 40K low barrier to entry grant. They're ultimately thinking about making a game, very rarely thinking about making a business at studio. Mm-hmm. And then because we coach our applicants on the way in, if they require it, if they need that help and they want to ask, we actually offer that. Mm-hmm. Because the thing is, and this again comes back to that why we are here to make studios and I mean, our KPIs are on how many jobs that we create, and of course how long do those jobs keep going afterwards. They are not around making another game. And so we are always telling our grantees and anyone in our applicant pool, think about what you're doing now with this product, absolutely, but also think about why you're doing it and what does the long term really look like, and where do you see yourself in 5-10 years time. The other focus of ours is, of course, we're in the middle of a skills crisis at the moment, so like the win isn't always in, like we might have a developer that comes through, wins a 40, is awarded a 40 grand grant or even a 20 grand grant, whatever. They make a prototype and then it just doesn't go anywhere, because it's actually unreasonable to expect every single grant to take up and fly as a business. But when they do that, they've got skills that they didn't have at the opposite end from when they start. Mm-hmm. And that increases the skills. And this is why, why Dunedin is suddenly that's a more skilled developer.
Yeah.
So, and then of course they might get picked up by another grantee, moving on to a startup and growing the business, or just another business in its entirety. Mm-hmm. And that's valuable. That's it. I mean, the trick is, if you're looking at a single city approach, then you want to keep that within the city. If you're looking at a national approach, then you want to keep that in the country.
Yeah.
In Australia, we're looking at on a state-by-state basis about holding those employees and those skills in that region.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I hope Dunedin becomes a good use case to see. Would Code fund remote teams, or do they have to be local and based in Dunedin?
Right now, we have a rule that 80% of the grant money must be spent within Dunedin city limits. That's that's the nature of regional funding programs. And this is actually really stock standard in this business. If you were to go and apply for a Screen West grant in my hometown in Western Australia, you'd be facing a very similar sort of ratio in terms of the actual grant monies themselves. But in terms of remote teams, that's the hard part with these kinds of regional targeted funding programs, is because the teams are in the changes to go for more remote teams now, obviously because the pandemic has accelerated that. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's reasonable, particularly with either looking at that state or that national scenario, to fund stuff that's not within the jurisdiction in a huge way, because that's not what the money's for. And particularly, when I worked on programs in Australia, of course, we've got states in Australia, and of course, then I've got the developer goes, but I've got the other person in Brisbane or in Melbourne or a city that's not in the state. Can I still pay for them? It's the answer. Actually, you know what? You've got to meet the financial obligation over here, because you're asking. It is unreasonable to ask for. Say you're dealing with Screen Queensland and you're working out of Brisbane. It's unreasonable to ask the Queensland government to pay for someone's wage in Melbourne. It's not what the money's for.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's pretty fair, I guess. Money is given for a reason. And
say you're looking at, even if you're looking at a national level in New Zealand, it would be unreasonable for you to pay for some salary in Australia.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, so going to Australia, there's been a lot of conversation over the last like 6 months to a year when the digital games tax offset, which we'll refer to as DGTO
DTO. It's a
from
mouthful, isn't it?
now on, which offered, I don't know the exact terms, but 30% tax incentives for game studios to exist, and that's going to push a lot of new business in Australia, and there's a lot of conversation of trying to get something similar in New Zealand. I guess and there's a lot of questions, and I know we could probably talk about this for hours, but I guess one broad question I want to ask is, what are your thoughts on a tax offset for games, and is it the best way for game studios to be funded?
Is it the best way? Is it a way? And I don't want to get into the political argy-bargy, but that's the last thing I want to get into.
Or what are some other ways maybe that could be a solution, maybe?
So, to my mind, like a tax offset is one way of stimulating, but you are hitting larger studios when you do that. You're hitting, because it's like and there's no detail in the public about the Australian DGTO right now, which is something. So when people are forming an opinion on it, I would advise caution, because with these things, the devil is always in the detail. Like, until you have an inclusion list, so specifically what things are included. It's something you just said is that they get offered a 30% rebate to exist. No, they don't. You get a 30% rebate on what is specifically included costs, and anything that falls outside of those definitions does not get that rebate on it. And specifically, when you're thinking about it, again, it falls into that thing. And that's, so if I'm a studio based in Melbourne and then I have remote workers in Singapore, they are not included. There is no way in hell that they will be included. That's just not how these programs work, full stop. And I'm kind of, in a very, very roundabout way, I'm kind of responsible for this a little bit, because I actually I did the drafting on the first program that actually got launched in Australia like this for games, which was actually in South Australia with South Australian Film Corp. Drove this one, and I got a week to write it, which was fun. I didn't sleep. But what I would say is, so the entry point with the Australian program is 500K Australian.
Which rules out
sorry?
Which must rule out like 90% of studios, right?
Exactly. So most businesses in Australia are 0 to 5 person studios. Most of them. Now, what we are seeing, of course, is the bigger overseas, in Australia, we're seeing the bigger overseas companies, Sledgehammer Games, Wargaming Sydney, Gameloft in Brisbane, they're all more rolling into town, that sort of way. And we've had some homegrown success stories as well. There's a couple of studios that have grown up and are now listed on the Australian Securities Exchange, and they've turned, they're multi-million-dollar companies now. So obviously those kinds of businesses are the ones that really take the best advantage of it. What happens if you're a 2-person studio and your average game spend or your project budget is about 200K, which is not much. And you're looking at these things. I mean, we talk about giving away 150K and people change their life. It's 200K is not much to make a game. So I would always advocate a 2-pronged approach as a minimum. Grants on the low end first, because that gets you your skills maturity, and it stands up more companies to start with, and then coming in as a secondary approach with an offset of some description. And there are many different ways that you can implement them technically. You can go through the taxation law, you can go it as an offset from an inclusion list. There's lots of different ways that you can do it, but they typically benefit larger businesses. And I mean, like 500K by the same token isn't a lot, really. It's not out of reach of many studios, but there's really small, it doesn't really particularly benefit startups that much. Perhaps the only benefit that it really gives for startups is if a bigger company chooses to upskill a worker, that will usually be on an inclusion list, and that worker then decides to leave and go and work for an indie company. It's really kind of around the houses ecosystem way of looking at it. Whereas obviously with the small grants, you get more companies, you have more chances. But the other thing too about this is, again, that skills-centric approach. where's the education for staff, for companies large and small coming from?
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of different ways that you can stimulate. It's a toolbox, there's no one best way of doing it.
Yeah, no, I love that comment about it's, the devil in the details. Like one small clause can negate a whole corner of the industry, whatever it might be. And I think you're right. And that goes against social media with people reacting to headlines and jumping at people's opinions without an educated or understanding of the problem.
If I wanted to be critical on it, I mean, so there was an announcement a few weeks ago, and I'm not going to sit here and diss Australia or diss New Zealand or approaches and not such thing, but there was a headline a few weeks back when there was an announcement that they'd increased the fund for live ops games to specifically accommodate live ops games, and I think it was like $18 million per annum that increased the budget on it. That's the first thing. 70, isn't it? Like the figure I've heard flying around, don't quote me on this, was that 75% of the video games industry revenue is on live ops games right now. That is literally, when I did it myself, that was the first hurdle I came to, was going, well, I'm trying to adapt from a framework that's taken from VFX offsets, because that's what is most common. It's the closest thing I've got. But a VFX offset on a TV series or a movie, that it starts and it finishes. Whereas a live ops game, I mean, that could be running for 10 years. So how then do I get this framework, which is more the convention that the agencies are used to dealing with, work on a live ops game? The fact that 8 months after they've announced it, that's when we hear about this, that's a concern. That's I mean, that was something like this literally day one, right? And so I'm not going to, I mean, there's probably a good answer why this has all happened. I am not privy to those discussions because I'm not working on this one. But that is the question I would ask. Why are we only thinking about this now?
Yeah, and that's just another another sentence that spurs a whole other thread of discussion, which sounds like there's still a lot of work to do. There's no one quick solution, and anything at a government level takes time. And especially just the games industry evolving so much. I have a lot of questions in that regard as well, as to how you feel about innovations in, blockchain gaming, for example, which there are a few companies popping up here and there. And I guess if I was to frame this as a question that I would like to get some value from, it would be, how, from your experience working at a government level, how long do you think it takes for something like this, which is still so new, so innovative, so unknown, how long would that take to be considered at a government level for something like this?
So in terms of games, I mean, NFTs and blockchain, because of the scope of money that we give an individual developer, is almost completely out of scope. Because, ultimately, before the initial release, we're going to give you up to 190K New Zealand, which again, in the world scale, just isn't actually that much money. I mean, it looks like a lot if you're a new developer and you've got nothing. But then like that thing that you said when you interviewed Eric, 40K is a lot of money, then it is. And then, of course, if you run an indie studio, you know exactly how not much it really is. Particularly, you have to start paying other people. So NFTs, they just don't fall. I mean, they cost more than that to make. And this is only opinion, but from a lot of the research and reading I'm doing at the moment, there's a lot of regulation coming. So that's the only thing I would say is, and right now, I mean, I do some private consulting, and I generally ask, they get excited, like my private investors who don't come from the game industry, they're setting up this entertainment fund, they're really excited, and of course this thing comes in, this NFT thing, and someone made $300,000, and I'm going, yeah, but you guys put 5 to 10 million into each of the feature films that you work on.
Yeah,
what's 300K for you?
Yeah,
it's like, let's not go on the hype train. Let's go, where's the actual, the blockchain technology, where is the opportunity? We know about the environmental stuff. There's a lot of talk about the environmental offsets and how much I should be doing that. The other thing too is, again, looking at something like, if you're an investor working in this space, moving into a regulatory framework, when there's a regulatory framework coming, you are going to get devalued. And it's not it's going to be on sentiment alone, regardless of what those rules actually look like when they come out. So maybe everybody, take a chill pill. We'll see what it actually looks at the tail end. I don't dislike those technologies on principle, but I'm not seeing the win yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting talking about unregulated things, and there's a lot of unregulated areas of the internet that still haven't been regulated at a government level that are coming down the line, and it's just it's really interesting because one regulation can completely destroy an industry that you know when people don't understand how important regulation can be, it is a really risky place to be betting on.
It is, and I would say as well, I know there are games companies that are doing super well with the investment and all that sort of thing. And I think an example of people who seem to be doing it well is Immutable in Sydney. They've seem to have a very good business. And they seem to be very mindful about how they advertise themselves and how they apply and the stuff they've got going on. I'm not saying it can't be done well. I'm just saying that there's a lot of hype for 99% of it. I'm not seeing the value translate. And of course, when I talk to my private clients, that's the stuff I'm looking at, is where, we're all sitting here talking about how awesome the Halo Infinite single player campaign is. That went all around that because they released a really great single player campaign. It's like, what's wrong with making experience first and then using things to enhance experience where appropriate? To me, that feels like I'm old now. I've been in this industry 12 years, and then tech for too many. But though that seems to me to be the far more sustainable strategy, is to build in. Let's just concentrate on delivering great experiences first, build that community and that player base, and then we build from there.
Yeah, that's one thing I want to touch on is the idea that games are a form of art rather than like a technology. I want to know if this causes problems at a government level when it comes to defining what a game is or which bucket it sits in.
I mean, if you're the Ministry of Culture, it doesn't. I'm sorry, I'm still catching up on the New Zealand department there. It's not that. I mean, games are and can be a form of art. They can be a form of commercial art. It's not like it's a finite, that's purely commercial and that's purely art. There are, of course, games that are both. It's very difficult with some of the clonal match 3 games you find on mobile app stores to go, well, that's any form of art whatsoever. But I mean, I look at the stuff that we've got coming through code, and it's like, okay, so one of the ones that I never tire about talking about is Adify Interactive's game, Toroa, which is about a royal albatross traveling up the New Zealand coastline, and the narration's all with Te Reo Māori speaker, and it's going to be with language translated into subtitles when released, but they're going to keep that Te Reo. I mean, if you think about, this is the example, right? Because you could be a kid, or you could be a 15-year-old in Berlin, and the only exposure you've ever had to New Zealand or Aotearoa is you might have seen the All Blacks do a haka on the World Cup rugby. Yeah. I mean, that's realistically it, right? And suddenly you get this wonderful, sumptuous experience and a big dose of New Zealand culture and Te Ao Māori themes. And there's no effort in it. You just get to enjoy the ride. I mean, the only effort is obviously playing the game.
Yeah.
That sort of stuff. That's why I joined on with code. This stuff excites me, right? Yeah. So with code, we do look at commerciality first. We look at an indie game studio that can translate into a commercial offering, but we don't want to do soulless shit. We do want to do stuff that feels awesome. Again, stuff that people will talk about. And I mean, it's not going to happen with everyone, but that's the stuff that really excites me. Yeah. And of course, there are commercial grants, there are hybrid, and there are pure art grants. And this is a thing when I did a lecture for NZGDC last year, and one of the key points was find out what the agency wants first and walk backwards from that. If you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, you're wasting the assessor's time and you're actually wasting your own as well. And I mean, I would fully say, what is your aim out of all this? And when I'm working at programs, and of course, when I'm when I'm working on programs, the first thing I ask is, where do we want to be at the end of this? What's the goal? And it is different for different agencies because they have different KPIs, different goals, different mindset, different philosophies. But find that point and just always walk backwards from there. Otherwise, you just will not be successful because you're hitting on the wrong touch points.
Yeah, that's a really, really good piece of advice for anyone. You can't just apply for the latest New Zealand Film Commission fund and then use that same application for, the startup fund, or depending on your situation, whatever. It's. All...
I do some work with Film Commission, and their goal is different.
Yeah.
Their goal is all about promotion of New Zealand stories, which is perfect. I mean, that's exactly what they exist to do.
Yeah.
So you need to write that. But again, there is a small business aspect as part of their grant, because of course, how are you going to do it? Like the other trick is how am I for an indie dev is how am I going to get eyes on my product? The other huge mistake that people make is that they come in at the front end. Oh, I've got this great idea for a game, blah, 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 here's all my stuff. And there's no, where's the rest? Because it costs, again, looking at from Film Commission perspective, that's an R&D grant, and it gives you 25 or 50 grand, depending which tier you apply for. Where's the rest of the money from the back of the game? Because it's going to cost more.
Yeah.
Even if you are at home working part-time, living on beer and 2-minute noodles. That's what we call in kind in this side of things. The hours that you are just burning up your own time. But you still have to live.
Yeah.
So that's the question that indie devs need to ask themselves when they're applying for these kinds of. And even if I'm making an art game, well, I still want people to see it, right? For God's sake.
Yeah, and marketing and everything. What I love the most that I think sets Code apart from other programs is that, like you mentioned at the beginning, the kind of coaching that you focus on upskilling the developer throughout their process, so that even just at the end of the application phase, they've learned so much, whether they get accepted or not. And I guess I want to ask a question regarding the legal, business, and management side of games and building a studio that a lot of game developers don't think about. And I know you do a lot of coaching on that side, but if you were giving advice to a game developer that was outside of Otipoti, or that doesn't have access to any kind of funds, what advice would you give for them to focus on the business, legal, and management side of their game if they're building a prototype for it?
So things that you want to, and this is for if you are just making games and you want to, with the intention of putting it on an app store somewhere and making some, if not any, money out of it. You need an accountant who is familiar, or you can educate in terms of getting the track. So that's point one. If you are founding a company, you need someone who can help you out and advise you on the company structure and all that. Because a lot of this stuff is get it right first time. You don't have to worry about it again. Point two, if you are taking someone's money, you need insurances. And that doesn't matter if it's grant, BC, your parents, a Kickstarter, you need basic coverage of your public liability, personal indemnity, public liability insurances. Don't leave home without it. And they can be done quite cheaply. The other one I would consider is talking to a trademark and patent attorney quite early, in case you need to. You might not need to do anything just yet. As a prototype, if you're making a prototype, you don't. But just having it ready to push the button on those structures when you need to take place. Getting your support, having a good relationship with a contract lawyer or a commercial lawyer is just a good idea. These relationships will sustain you throughout your career. They might change, it might shift, or not every lawyer does everything. If you are two people going into a studio together, do you have a partnership agreement? Do you have a shareholders agreement? What is your structure? These are the things that actually stop arguments later. Because what the nightmare scenario is that you've gone in with a 2-person studio, or we've made this game, it's gone off.
Yeah.
There's suddenly a lot of money, or there's suddenly, a lot of money, whatever that looks like to you, in this equation. And suddenly that's what the argument becomes about, because you've got no way of distributing that money back to yourselves. Yeah.
It's really good
and
advice.
And get something and both of you sign it. If you're in that, or whatever that leadership structure looks like, whatever the ownership structure is, sign it. So everybody knows where they stand.
Mhm.
Even if there's an agreement of we're just going to go into a partnership and this is going to be it. We'll take 50% each.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Just life advice, I'd say, but beyond career advice.
This isn't games. This is
Yeah.
like, how do I start a convenience store, right?
Yeah, like how to start anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. And you said that in a really succinct and clear way, and all the things you rattled off make a lot of sense. So I'm trying to think. We've only got a few minutes left to chat, and I'm just trying to think of what other like easy wins I can get out of you to just help people understand, how to I guess progress through their journey. Is
You guys
there?
are really because breaking the fourth wall a bit, but you've given me some test questions.
Yes.
One of your questions was, how do I get into the games industry as a minority?
Yes, please address that. I would love that for you. And
Um,
minority covers any ground,
yeah.
at all. Yeah, what would you say to that?
Obviously, I'm in one particular minority, but I can't speak to the experience of everyone else's minority. But the gaming industry is having a significant cultural shift at the moment where we are moving to be more inclusive.
Mhm.
And for a lot of it, of the industry, this is still rhetoric. It's not translating into anything that's in nuts and bolts. Because I'm talking about inclusivity and diversity. I mean, like diversity can be, I'm a parent and this industry doesn't have a lot of parents in it.
Mhm.
But I mean, obviously anything to do with disability, ethnicity, sometimes minority religious status, sexuality, gender identity, all that sort of stuff. I mean, like the big bucket. But there's a lot of companies who are, and I mean, this doesn't apply if you're just going for a grant. Although if you are applying for a grant, mention what that you are a member of said minority or whatever intersections and cross that you're in, because we have KPIs on that. Because we're trying to open up employment. Like it's not touchy feely. We're trying to open up employment pools here, so we need to know about who we've got coming through the door. And I mean, if there's a particular minority that is being excluded from the industry, we need to know about that. But almost like if I'm coming in and I'm interviewing at a larger company that's more established, you're almost interviewing them back.
Mm.
In my experience, because I came out as trans halfway through my career, like I left one career and went full-time in games when I did that. It happened at the same time, because that was part of the reason why I went to games. It's because I felt that I had a future in the games industry. And for the most part, that's been absolutely true. On that note, I've had a really good ride. Because the games industry is quite a proportionally high amount of trans people, and in fact, just LGBTQIA people in the games industry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to say there's still not shitty barriers, because there are.
Yeah.
And that is why you're interviewing your company back, the company aware of you applying to it. The other, it's hard when you're starting out a little bit because you won't have those specializations. Like I am a hyper specialist. This is what I do. I work on grants and stimulus in the video game industry. But that's carried me through. That's why I got my job. I didn't get my job because it was a diversity hire. I got my job because I walked in and I knew everything about the subject with this new agency that was starting.
Yeah.
Well, not everything, enough, more than the people who hired me.
Totally.
Because of all where things were at the time. But if you're in that situation where you are the specialist, you are the knowledge, suddenly the power dynamic changes, because you have more power in there. So obviously a few years into your career, you will find that dynamic will change. But in the meantime, like I said, the best thing that you can do is interview back. What is your policy that can deal with my form of diversity?
Mm-hmm.
And that can be, I mean, like, and a really great thing as well, one of the only few good things that's come out of the pandemic is the propensity to allow remote work.
Mm-hmm.
Because that means that, like, we like with code, we've got a team and they have and in the principals in the standard, the two leads, they've got physical disability.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly not having to leave the house is a real benefit to them. Well, like it's a really benefit to how they can manage their career within the industry. But looking at, so do I need remote work options? Do I need to have flexible time options? How am I going, like, do I need to work particularly if I've got something like chronic fatigue syndrome or another form of physical illness that affects fatigue, do I have to work a full-time role? Things like that, and how you can fit around. The game industry has become a lot more flexible on how we deal with these forms. But like I say, you need to get a company that's willing to engage with that. And it's not just from a hiring perspective, it's from a daily, like it's got to work for you every day. And I mean, I'm not going to say that prejudice still doesn't exist and all that, because it absolutely does, but there are ways and means of working with that in the industry.
Yeah. You've done an amazing job, and I think you're an incredible advocate for diversity, and I hope you'd feel comfortable with anyone reaching out to you if they have any questions or concerns.
I'm happy to talk, but the other thing too is remember that I've learned these lessons because I got it wrong.
Yeah.
Even like I say, when I talk about my own company's culture, we got things like that wrong. We were not as inclusive as we should have been with certain things. We weren't deliberately malicious, but we just got the formula wrong. And there's nothing like getting it wrong to teach you those hard lessons and go, oh, okay, that's what happens if you get it wrong.
No, that's amazing.
And I mean, like I know we've only got a few minutes left, but this is like my thing, is that I do the job that I do now, and I got into the advocacy space because starting an indie studio is really, really hard.
Yeah.
And I was going like, and I saw at the time when I was first getting in, it's all Victoria have a great funding program. How come we're in West Australia? How come we don't have a great funding program? And of course, that's the thing that whenever I post a social media post on more developers, just New Zealand developer channels, the first thing is, what about the rest of New Zealand? What about Auckland? What about Wellington? Yeah. And I get why they're doing that, because I saw that that's where I started. The question you have to ask yourself is, what can I do to actually help us go and get one? And that doesn't mean I tweet at the minister saying, why can't we have games funding in my jurisdiction? That means you join with the people who are advocating in that space.
Yeah.
You learn about what that landscape actually looks like. You go one of the hardest things for an advocate is you end up carrying a huge load. And that's something I very much felt like I was, I am one of a handful of advocates in my own space working to improve these conditions. Working with code, of course, all this weight is lifted off. But because no one, and people aren't willing to spend the time to actually help in a constructive way. I mean, that's a little bit of an ad for the NZGDA right there. But I wouldn't be saying this if I hadn't lived it, and you get involved and you learn, and you don't go and just tweet at the minister. You learn what can I do to help that is meaningful and constructive. Because the other worst thing you can do is just talk about the negatives all the time. You can talk about, one of the fantastic things about working in startup video game funding, we've got this kind of government grant business, is a little bit of money goes so far. I mean, like I had one applicant who came through and it was successful on their second time. Completely messed up the first time around, not going to lie. It was one of those ones that I read it and went, okay, yeah, that's not going to get funded. I mean, I'm not the person that makes the decisions because we have a panel for that, but yeah, you get my point. I can almost pick on these days. But the second one, he came in and the strategy was a million different directions about it, and literally every point.
Yeah.
And then he got his 40 grand. And he was physically vibrating when I told him. He was so excited. I had him on the screen in front of him because again, the remote thing. And he's just sitting there going, because he's so excited. And that's the life-changing stuff.
But he learned from his mistakes, which is great to hear.
We also got him some mentorship, which helped.
Yeah.
We got him a third-party mentorship outside our organization. It's one of the cool things we can do. But again, why wouldn't everyone want that? And I get those arguments, but again, like regional development programs also exist for a reason and are valid. That's part of the other argument that I see a lot of is going, well, why are you investing in that one? Like the answer is because I need it. because it's not as developed as other regions.
Yeah.
Because okay, it sucks if you are Joe, Safine, Indy in a region that's not covered with a particular program. And I totally get that because I've been there. It's how I got into advocacy. But the better thing to do is, well, that is an awesome case study. How do I go and take that to someone and make my opinion matter in all of this? Because the worst thing you can do is just sit around complaining, going, well, I don't get it, so it all sucks. And screw those guys.
Yeah.
Because that's not constructive for anyone.
Yeah.
That's my finger wag.
That's great. There's definitely so much, just with your experience, there's so much value that I know you can share. And if anyone's interested in hearing more from Vee, you did a great NZGDC talk last year that you can find on YouTube. I'm sure if you just search NZGDC 21 and then Vee's name, it should pop up, which you can learn in more detail about about the different areas that you love to talk about.
That was purely about putting together a good grant application package.
which is a lot, that can help a lot of people. And I just think the games industry, especially in New Zealand, but just I think globally as well, is really lucky to have someone like you with the experience that you have, advocating for the things that you do. And I'm really hopeful that Code is going to be a success, that the developers and the studios that you're helping build and mentor are going to be incredibly successful, whatever that definition is. I just feel like you have the right amount of care and love and experience on how it actually gets done to see it through. So I cannot wait to see these projects at Code kind of mature and release their games out to the world and see them succeed. So yeah, thank you so much for your time and coming on the podcast. If anyone's interested in following Vee, you can find her on Twitter at Vee_Garpend, Garpend. Or you can find the latest information about Code and their latest funding grants, their latest initiatives. If you're interested in their service grant, that might be your thing. You can go find out about that. That's all at dunedinNZ.com/code. And yeah, is there anything else, Vee, that you'd like to share to the people listening that might be indie devs, corporate game developers, anyone that's in the games industry? Is there anywhere else you'd like to point them to, or advice that you'd like to give them?
I guess my little bit of life advice is, and it's a hard one because, again, experience and everything, but carry yourself with a little bit of kindness. There was a time in my life when I didn't do that, and I felt the effects of that later. Now, and of course, now my whole career is like I get to celebrate the wins with other people. Don't be afraid to be a cheerleader. There we go. Don't be afraid to be a cheerleader.
Love that. That's quotable. You can fit that in a tweet. I love that. I'm gonna tweet that right now, and then we can engage with it and keep that conversation going with the wider Twitter community. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom. And I would love to have you on again one day once there's a few mature code companies out there to hear how your perspective.
Let's talk when we got more wins, hey? And then we'll sit here clinking glasses virtually, and we'll have a good time.
Absolutely. But I love your positivity at this stage anyway. It's exciting to know that it's only going to go up from here. So thank you for your time. I hope you managed to get into New Zealand safely, and maybe one day we'll be able to see each other in person. Who knows?
Hopefully sometime this year. All right.
All right. Take care.
Great talking with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Zero to Play podcast. I hope you learned something about game development, the games industry as a whole, or the future of games. You can follow us on Twitter at Zero to Play, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Spotify, or any other podcasting service. Other than that, you can find links to this episode down in the description below, and I'll see you guys next week for the next episode.